She was 10, he was a billionaire. And just seconds before signing the biggest deal of his life, his daughter stood up and said 4 words that stopped everything. It's a forgery. The evening air inside the Hale estate was quiet, calm, the kind of stillness that settles just before a storm. Golden lights flickered from ornate chandeliers, casting soft reflections on the marble floors. Somewhere down the hall, a pianist played gently, background music for a carefully curated dinner party attended by billionaires, board members, and the ever-watchful media. But none of that mattered to 10-year-old Ellie. She sat quietly near the large window in the dining room, her pale blue dress spread neatly over the upholstered chair, her legs barely reaching the floor. Her long blonde hair, brushed perfectly by the housekeeper earlier, now framed a delicate, worried face. Her wide blue eyes watched everyone, especially one person, Victoria. Victoria stood at the far end of the room beside Richard Hale, CEO, tech mogul, and Ellie's adoptive father. With perfectly curled blonde hair, emerald green eyes, and a white dress tailored to perfection, Victoria was the picture of charm. She smiled, laughed, touched Richard's arm at all the right moments. People admired her. They always did. Ellie didn't. Richard, dressed in a tailored navy suit, looked every bit the powerful figure he was in the press. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features softened only by the kindness in his dark brown eyes. His every move was precise, his voice steady, calm. But Ellie knew there was something behind that calm, something deeper. Pain. He still carried it, though he never spoke of it. 3 years ago, his wife and young son were killed in a car crash. The world mourned the tragedy, the media mourned with them. But it was Richard who had quietly disappeared from the spotlight, returning months later with a little girl no one recognized. Ellie, the orphaned daughter of his late best friend. No one questioned it, and Ellie never asked why he chose her. She just knew he had saved her, and she loved him for it. Tonight, though, something felt wrong. Not with Richard, with Victoria. Ellie had never liked her, not in the way children dislike new people in their parents' lives, but in the way animals sense a tremor in the earth before anyone else notices. Victoria was too perfect, her smile too wide, her compliments too polished. And the way she looked at Ellie, as if Ellie were an inconvenient detail, a small, fragile obstacle to a much larger prize. While the adults toasted and exchanged polite laughter, Ellie slipped away from the table, unnoticed. She padded silently through the hall, the hem of her dress brushing the floor. It wasn't unusual for her to wander the house. She knew every corner, every stair, every creak in the wooden floorboards. She walked slowly, letting the sound of voices drift behind her. And then she heard it. A voice she recognized, quiet but sharp. Victoria. Ellie stopped just outside the study door, which was cracked open half an inch. Her breath caught in her throat. "I told you," Victoria hissed into her phone. "The papers are in his hands. He'll sign them tomorrow. He won't even check the fine print. It's done. 3 weeks from now, this company, this house, it'll all be mine." Ellie's heart slammed against her ribs. She leaned closer, almost afraid to hear more. "No, the originals are gone," Victoria continued. "Shredded. These are perfect copies, except for the details, of course. Clause 17, Section C. The part that hands over his voting control? That's the one he won't notice. Trust me, he's brilliant in business, but blind when it comes to me." A laugh, cold, quiet, calculated. Ellie backed away slowly, her small hand clutching the wall for balance. Her breath came faster now. Her chest tightened. She didn't fully understand what Clause 17 meant, but she understood enough. Victoria was lying. She was tricking Richard, and it was going to happen tomorrow. She ran to her room, locked the door, and curled up under the blanket. The chandelier lights flickered in the hallway as voices echoed back into the dining room. But Ellie lay still, trembling, her mind racing. She had to do something. But who would believe a 10-year-old girl? Ellie didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the soft light of her night lamp painting shifting shadows on the walls. The silence in the room felt heavy, like something pressing on her chest. Her hands clutched the blanket, but she wasn't cold. She was scared. She replayed every word Victoria had whispered in the study, the tone, the laugh, the way she said, "It'll all be mine." Ellie wasn't naive. She didn't understand all the technical parts, clauses, contracts, percentages, but she understood betrayal. And this wasn't some game or misunderstanding. This was a trap, one that would snap shut tomorrow. On him, Richard, her father, the man who saved her when she had nothing left, the man who made her pancakes when she couldn't sleep, who carried her to bed when she pretended not to be tired, who cried silently at night when he thought she wasn't listening. He was everything to her, and Victoria was going to hurt him, but how could she stop it? The next morning came faster than Ellie expected. The sun streamed through her window, warm and bright. Too bright. The house buzzed with excitement. Staff moved quickly, polishing the silver trays, aligning floral arrangements, preparing for the arrival of guests. The merger was the biggest business event of the year. Cameras would be present, investors, executives. A perfectly staged photo of Richard Hale signing a contract that would cement his legacy, and no one knew it was a lie. Ellie sat at the breakfast table picking at her cereal. She hadn't spoken to anyone. Her stomach twisted as she watched Victoria walk into the room, radiant in a pale silk blouse and pearl earrings, holding a tablet and a coffee cup like the perfect future CEO's wife. She leaned down to kiss Richard's cheek and said something sweet that made him smile. Ellie wanted to scream. Instead, she sat frozen, a little girl in a big world that wouldn't listen. She wanted to run to Richard, to tell him everything. But Victoria's words echoed in her head again. He won't even check. He's blind when it comes to me. Would he believe her? Would anyone? After breakfast, Victoria suggested they take a few family pictures for the press. She stood between Richard and Ellie in the grand hallway, one hand delicately on Richard's shoulder, the other lightly touching Ellie's back. Her smile was flawless. Ellie forced a half smile for the camera, but her heart was racing. She felt Victoria's hand press a little harder, not affectionately, but like a warning. Later, Ellie wandered the halls alone again. This time, she didn't want to play or explore. She walked slowly, her shoes silent on the carpets, her mind spinning with worry. Maybe she should talk to Richard privately. Maybe she should write him a note. Maybe she should. She turned a corner and saw Victoria standing by the main staircase, whispering into her phone again. No, she heard nothing, Victoria was saying, her voice low but rushed. She's just a kid. She didn't say a word this morning. I smiled. I touched her hair. She probably thinks we're best friends. Ellie stepped back quickly, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart pounded. Victoria knew. She knew Ellie had been there. Ellie rushed back to her room and shut the door quietly, then locked it. She sat at her desk and opened her sketchbook. Not to draw, but to think. Her fingers curled tightly around a pencil as she stared at the blank page. What could she do? She couldn't expose the forged documents herself. She hadn't even seen them. She couldn't ask the staff. They all adored Victoria. The company lawyers wouldn't listen to a child. And Richard, what if he really was blind when it came to her? What if love made him deaf to the truth? Ellie wiped her eyes quickly with her sleeve. No, she couldn't give up. Richard needed her. Even if no one listened, even if her voice was small, she had to try. She stood up and walked to the closet, pulled out the light blue dress her father had picked for her weeks ago for the big day. She didn't want to wear it anymore. Not for this, but she did. Not because of Victoria's plan, because she was going to stop it. She brushed her hair carefully and looked at herself in the mirror. Her hands were still trembling, but her eyes were fierce now. She was just a girl, but tomorrow she would speak, and she wouldn't stop until someone listened. The day of the merger dawned crisp and cloudless, the kind of morning that felt designed to host a perfect ending. The Hale estate buzzed with movement. Drivers pulled sleek black cars up the circular drive. Security guards in discreet suits lined the outer gates. Inside, florists and assistants made last-minute adjustments to decorations. Everything gleamed. The crystal glasses, the marble floors, the silver pens arranged beside the contract. Ellie stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching it all unfold below her. Her light blue dress brushed against her knees, perfectly pressed, but her hands gripped the banister tightly. From here, she could see the world her father lived in, one of suits and handshakes and million-dollar smiles. A world where no one ever looked down far enough to notice a 10-year-old girl watching them all. Victoria floated through the foyer like a queen heading to her coronation. Her white dress shimmered slightly under the chandelier light. her green eyes scanning the room with practiced grace. She looked every inch the supportive fiancé, pausing to smile for cameras, kissing cheeks and murmuring words of encouragement to Richard. Richard looked calm, composed. His Navy suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable as he spoke to the lawyers and board members gathering near the long conference table. Ellie knew that look. It was the face he wore when he was focused, and when he was vulnerable. He trusted the people around him. He trusted her, and Ellie knew he was walking straight into a trap. She stood frozen for a moment at the top of the stairs. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. Her mouth was dry. She wanted to run, to hide, to wait until it was all over. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Victoria hadn't actually gone through with it. Maybe someone else had already noticed something suspicious. Maybe someone else would say it first. But no one did. The room shifted. Everyone was taking their seats. Reporters stood along the wall. A photographer lifted his camera. One of the lawyers handed Richard a black pen trimmed with gold. Victoria stood beside him, one hand gently placed on his back. The contract, thick, precise, dangerous, lay open on the table in front of him. This was it. Ellie walked down the stairs. No one noticed her at first. The soft pad of her shoes on the carpet was drowned out by the hum of polite conversation and rustling papers. But when she stepped into the center of the room, all eyes turned. She looked small against the massive backdrop of corporate power, a child in a room full of giants. But her voice didn't shake. "Dad," she said, her tone firm, steady, "don't sign it." Richard paused, the pen hovering an inch above the paper. His head turned slowly. "Ellie?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "What's going on?" She stepped forward. Her heart beat so hard it hurt, but she kept going, one step at a time, until she stood beside him, between him and the contract. "I heard her," she said, pointing at Victoria. "Last night, on the phone. She said the documents were fake. She said you wouldn't notice, that you'd sign them and everything would become hers." The room fell into stunned silence. Victoria let out a soft, nervous laugh. "Sweetheart, what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sugar-coated, but the edges of her smile were cracking. "I'm not lying," Ellie said louder, her voice rising over the growing whispers. "She said it. She said she changed something. She said you wouldn't read the fine print. She called someone and said Clause 17 would give her control. I don't know what that means, but I know she lied." Everyone turned to Victoria now. The color had drained from her face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Richard slowly set the pen down. The lawyer nearest him cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Sir, I can re-review the final version of the contract, if you'd like. Just to confirm." "Do it," Richard said quietly, his voice low and heavy, with something unreadable. Victoria tried to speak. "She's just a kid," she snapped. "She probably misunderstood something. This is absurd. We're in the middle of a legal proceeding." "No," Richard said, finally looking at her. "We're in the middle of a decision that affects everything I've built. And my daughter, who has never lied to me, just stood in front of the entire board and told the truth." Victoria's eyes widened. "You're taking her word over mine?" "I'm taking a pause," he said. "And if even one line of what she said turns out to be true, I'm doing a lot more than that." Ellie felt her knees go weak, but she stood tall. Richard reached down and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "In fact," he said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear, "this signing is postponed, effective immediately." Reporters scrambled. The photographer's flash went off. The lawyer nodded quickly and began gathering the documents. Victoria stood frozen, lips pressed into a pale line. She didn't speak again. Ellie looked up at Richard. He didn't say anything, but his eyes met hers. And for the first time since her mother died, she saw something that looked like pride. Not just love, not just protection, but belief. The conference room emptied slower than usual, as if no one knew quite what to do after what had just unfolded. The press was ushered out first, still murmuring, still typing, still glancing back through the glass. The executives left in quiet pairs, some exchanging uncertain glances, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Even the lawyers moved differently now, more carefully, more tightly wound, as though the air itself had become sharper. Victoria remained standing near the long table, her white dress still flawless, but her composure cracked in 100 invisible places. Her green eyes darted from face to face, looking for a lifeline that no longer existed. A moment ago, she had been poised, powerful, the future Mrs. Hale. Now she looked like a statue that had been knocked off its pedestal and was waiting to shatter. Richard stood silently by the head of the table, one hand on the back of a chair, the other resting gently on Ellie's shoulder. His eyes were locked on Victoria, not angry, not cold, but unreadable. That, Ellie knew, was worse. Richard didn't yell when he was furious. He went still, thoughtful, deadly calm. It was how he had built an empire, with silence and precision. Victoria finally broke the silence. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice tighter now. "You're going to halt a billion-dollar deal because of something a little girl thinks she heard?" Ellie didn't flinch. She stood beside her father like a soldier. "I didn't think, I heard. I was outside your office. You said the papers were fake, that you changed them, that you were going to take everything from him." "Ellie," Victoria said, turning toward her with a smile that was suddenly too wide, "sweetheart, you must have misunderstood. Adults talk about all kinds of complicated things. You probably overheard a legal conversation you didn't understand. You're a child. You don't even know what a clause is." Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "She knows what betrayal sounds like." Victoria turned to him, her tone pleading now. "Richard, come on. We were this close. You and I, the merger, our life together. Don't let one moment, one confused child's fantasy, ruin everything." Richard stepped forward slowly, pulling Ellie gently with him. "Ellie doesn't lie," he said. "Ever. And I know her. I know her tone. I know her eyes when she's scared. I also know when someone I trust is lying to me." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You've had access to my files for weeks," he continued. "You've had late nights in my office, passwords you shouldn't have had. Every single security alert I ignored because I trusted you. I let you into my home, into my life, into her life." That last part hit harder than anything else. Victoria took a half step back. She knew she'd lost him, and she didn't like losing. "I want to speak to my lawyer," she said abruptly. "Now." "You'll get your chance," Richard replied, "after the internal audit. If any document in that folder is fraudulent, forged, or altered, it won't be me you'll be answering to." Victoria's mask dropped for the first time. Her face hardened, her jaw clenched. The warmth vanished, replaced with something sharp and bitter. "You have no idea what you've just thrown away." Richard raised his eyebrows. "No," he said. "I just realized what I almost lost." Two security officers entered the room on quiet command. One of the assistants had called them moments ago. They walked toward Victoria slowly, not aggressively, but firmly, professionally. One of them extended a hand. "Ms. Langford," he said, "we need to escort you off the premises. You'll be contacted for further legal inquiries." Victoria's nostrils flared. She looked one last time at Richard, then at Ellie. A glare, not a glance, and turned to leave without a word. Her heels echoed sharply on the marble floor until the sound disappeared entirely. And then the room was quiet. Ellie didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until that moment. Her body felt weightless and heavy all at once. She leaned slightly against her father's side, and he immediately pulled her close with one arm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She looked up at him. "Do you believe me now?" He looked down at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Deep sorrow, yes, but also fierce, unwavering love. "I believed you the moment you said my name." He sank into the chair behind him, still holding her hand. His other hand rubbed at his face. The weight of what had nearly happened, what had almost destroyed everything, finally landed fully in his body. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. "You saw what I didn't." "You didn't want to see it," Ellie replied. She smiled too much, and she looked at me like I was in the way. He nodded slowly. "You were never in the way. You've always been the reason." The lawyer re-entered the room a few minutes later, a folder in hand. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "we've begun reviewing the copies. There are inconsistencies in several pages. We'll do a full forensic document comparison, but at first glance, your daughter may have saved your company." Ellie blinked. Saved your company. But she hadn't done it for the company. She had done it for him. Richard looked at the folder, then back at Ellie. "I almost signed it," he whispered. "I almost gave everything away because I wanted to believe someone could love me again." Ellie reached for his hand. I already do. The hours after Victoria was escorted out passed in a blur. The legal team began working through the forged documents, comparing files, timestamps, and metadata. Richard gave terse, quiet orders, his usual commanding presence stripped down to something quieter. Not weaker, but rawer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He just moved like a man trying to process the moment he nearly handed over his entire life to someone who had planned to destroy it. By late evening, the estate was quiet again. The reporters had gone. The guests had been sent home. The security team remained, but their presence was discreet. Only the faintest echo of footsteps lingered in the wide halls. Ellie sat alone in the living room, her light blue dress wrinkled from the day. Her legs were curled under her on the couch and her chin rested on her knees. She wasn't crying, but she was tired. The kind of tired that didn't come from staying up too late, but from holding in too much. She didn't know if she'd done the right thing. Everyone had looked so shocked, so tense. She didn't like being the center of attention. She didn't want to humiliate anyone, not even Victoria. But she had heard what she heard, and she had known. If she didn't speak, her father would be ruined. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10. She hadn't seen Richard in hours. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered the familiar fear. Maybe now he'll look at me differently. Maybe I made things worse. Maybe I hurt him by telling the truth. She slid off the couch and padded barefoot down the hallway toward his study. The large wooden door was closed, but a soft glow came from underneath. She raised her hand to knock, but paused. Then slowly, she pushed it open. Richard sat behind his desk in the darkened room, lit only by the lamp on the corner and the flickering fireplace across from him. His suit jacket was draped over the back of a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up. In one hand, he held a photograph, a framed picture of his late wife and son. His other hand covered his eyes. He didn't look up when the door creaked open. Ellie stepped inside anyway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she cleared her throat gently. I didn't mean to ruin anything, she said in a small voice. I didn't know what else to do. Richard slowly lowered the photograph and turned to her. His eyes were tired, not just from the day, but from something deeper. But when he saw her, something softened. You didn't ruin anything, he said quietly. You saved everything. She walked to the edge of his desk but didn't sit. You're not mad? He gave the faintest smile. Mad. Ellie, I almost handed my company, my home, my life, you, to someone who didn't care about any of it. I should have seen it, but I didn't. Because I wanted it to be real. I wanted to believe I wasn't alone anymore. Ellie lowered her gaze. But you're not alone. You have me. He stood slowly, walked around the desk and knelt in front of her so they were eye level. I forgot that, he said. I was so focused on trying to rebuild what I lost that I didn't see what I already had. You! She looked up at him, eyes wide. Do you really mean that? He nodded. Ellie, I adopted you because I wanted to give you a home. But somewhere along the way, you became my reason to come home. Her throat tightened. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached forward and hugged him, tightly like she hadn't hugged him in months. He held her back just as fiercely. I was scared, she whispered. I thought you wouldn't believe me. I believe you more than I believe anyone, he said. I always will. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling in the corner, the shadows dancing along the walls, the house finally still. It wasn't a perfect ending. Nothing had been repaired yet. The contracts were still being reviewed. Victoria would likely fight back. The company would have to manage the fallout. But for the first time in years, Richard felt grounded, rooted. And not to a deal or a title or a legacy, but to a little girl in a wrinkled blue dress who had stood up in front of a room full of power and spoken the truth. You're brave, Ellie, he said finally. And because of you, we still have a future. She pulled back and looked him in the eye. As long as we have each other, right? Exactly, he said. Then he smiled, really smiled, for the first time all day. And for the first time since the merger fell apart, everything felt whole again. The days that followed were heavy with consequences. Richard's legal team worked around the clock, uncovering just how deep the forgery went. Victoria hadn't simply altered a few pages. She had orchestrated a methodical, calculated manipulation of multiple merger documents. The edits weren't obvious at first glance, but subtle enough to change the ownership structure of the new entity entirely. Had the contract been signed, Victoria would have gained voting power over critical corporate decisions, access to proprietary technology, and even the ability to remove Richard from his own board. It had been more than a betrayal. It had been a slow-motion takeover masked behind smiles and champagne. News broke within 48 hours. Headlines swirled, merger halted by CEO's daughter, child saves billion-dollar empire, CEO's fiancé accused of corporate fraud. Reporters called nonstop. Publicists scrambled to shape the story. Shareholders demanded explanations. But the company held firm, and Richard released only one brief statement to the press. The integrity of Hale Technologies remains intact thanks to the courage and honesty of my daughter. Ellie saw her name in the news for the first time. It didn't make her proud. It made her anxious. She didn't want fame or attention. She just wanted her father to be okay and to know she had done the right thing. That was enough. But things at home felt different. The house was quieter than usual. Not empty, but quiet in a way that made Ellie notice every tick of the clocks, every creak in the floors. Richard wasn't gone. He was around, working from his home office, holding meetings in the upstairs library. But he had become distant again. Polite, careful. She understood. Part of him was embarrassed. Another part was grieving, not for Victoria, but for the trust he had given her, and the illusion he had been willing to believe. He was protecting himself. That much was clear. Still, Ellie missed him. He no longer sat with her during dinner. He didn't ask about her reading, or brush her hair like he used to when she had trouble sleeping. He said goodnight at her door, but didn't come in. She wanted to ask him why, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she did what she always did when she was uncertain. She listened. She watched. One evening, almost a week after the halted signing, she passed by his study again. The door was cracked open just an inch. Inside, Richard stood with his back to her, looking out the window over the city lights. His voice was low, tired. He was on the phone. "She warned me," he said. "A 10-year-old child saw what I didn't, and she was right. How did I not see it?" A pause. No, the damage is contained. But the cost, it's not just financial. She almost got Ellie. She almost got my daughter. Another pause. I don't care about the headlines. What I care about is the fact that I let someone dangerous into our lives. And Ellie, his voice broke slightly. Ellie trusted me to keep her safe, and I almost failed. Ellie stepped back quietly, heart pounding. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but something inside her ached at hearing the truth out loud. Not just about the documents, about them, about her place in his world. He did care. He wasn't pushing her away. He was punishing himself. Later that night, when the house had settled and the lights were dim, Ellie found the courage to knock on his door. He opened it, surprised, but didn't say anything. Just stepped aside and let her in. She walked to his desk, sat down in the oversized leather chair opposite him, and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't wait for him to start. "You're not talking to me like you used to," she said softly, "and I know why. You're mad at yourself." "Not me." Richard lowered his gaze, then nodded slowly. "You're right. I didn't tell you what I heard because I wanted to ruin anything," she said. I couldn't let her take everything, especially not you." He crossed the room and sat across from her. For the first time in days, his eyes met hers directly. "I know. And you didn't just stop her, Ellie. You reminded me what it means to trust the right people. I should have trusted you from the beginning." "You did," she said, "when it mattered most." He smiled faintly. "That's the thing. You were the only one brave enough to say something when everyone else stayed quiet. And I'll never forget that." She stood up and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He hugged her back tightly, tighter than before. This wasn't a thank you. This was a promise, a beginning. "You're my daughter," he whispered, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that." Ellie didn't need anything more. The fear was gone now, the silence broken. Her family, small, imperfect, battered by loss, was still standing. And more than that, it was healing. In the quiet of that study, in the flicker of the desk lamp, in the fading buzz of city lights, they sat together. No headlines, no lawyers, no lies. Just a father and a daughter starting again. Spring came early that year. The trees outside the Hale estate bloomed with soft pink and white blossoms, and the cold, heavy silence that had settled over the house after the failed merger finally began to thaw. The light through the windows seemed warmer. The air inside the home no longer carried the echo of secrets or unspoken doubts. Something had shifted, not overnight, but gently, steadily, like the slow turn of the seasons. And at the center of that shift was Ellie. She was still 10, still small for her age, still quiet in rooms full of noise. But something about her presence had changed. People noticed when she entered a space now, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried a quiet strength that lingered even after she left. The staff treated her with a new kind of deference, not as the boss's daughter, but as someone who had protected him when no one else could. Richard noticed it too. At breakfast, he began asking for her opinion, not just about school or weekend plans, but real things, ideas, people, even news he'd read. When he reviewed documents, he sometimes slid a page toward her and asked, "What do you think this means?" He didn't do it to test her. He did it because he respected her judgment. It was in one of those conversations, a quiet morning over toast and orange juice, that Richard first mentioned a new idea. "I've been thinking about transparency," he said, spreading jam on a slice of toast without looking up. "About how close we came to losing everything, because people were too afraid to speak up, because I was too willing to trust the wrong voices." Ellie looked up from her cereal. "But you listened to me?" "I did," he nodded. "And it made me realize, what if there were more voices like yours? People who notice something but don't feel like they can say it. Not just kids, employees, interns, anyone." She set down her spoon, intrigued. "Like a place they could speak up?" "Exactly," he said. "A real program. Anonymous if they want. Protected. Encouraged. A system built on the idea that even the smallest voice matters. We could call it something simple. Like," he looked at her, "the voice of conscience." Ellie smiled. "That sounds like something you'd want me to run." Richard gave a half smile back. "Someday, maybe." They launched it within the month. Emails were sent, posters printed, seminars held. The voice of conscience became more than just an initiative. It became a philosophy, a hotline, a reporting system, a promise written into the company's values. What surprised Richard most wasn't how many people used it. It was who used it. Young assistants reported misfiled data. Junior engineers pointed out ethical concerns in development. An intern flagged a procurement irregularity that ended up saving millions. And in every case, the response wasn't punishment or panic. It was dialogue, change, growth. Ellie was involved from the start. She didn't sit in on meetings or manage the system, not officially, but her story was told with her permission at every internal training. She stood at the back of the room during the first session and listened to her father say, "Courage isn't about having power. It's about using your voice even when you're afraid." My daughter reminded me of that when I forgot. The room had been silent afterward, and then came applause. Not thunderous, not staged, but real. Outside the company, word spread quickly. News outlets followed up with quiet admiration. CEOs called for meetings. Invitations to speak poured in. But Richard turned most of them down. He had no interest in fame. His interest was here, at home, in the office, in rebuilding the culture from the inside out. At night sometimes, he and Ellie would sit on the back terrace, watching the garden lights flicker on. He would sip black coffee. She would drink hot chocolate. They wouldn't always talk about big things. Sometimes they just watched the stars or counted the lit windows in the city below. But one evening, as the wind moved gently through the trees, he said, "You know, I used to think success was measured in numbers. Stock prices, mergers, growth charts. Now I think maybe it's measured by who's still standing next to you when everything falls apart." Ellie leaned her head against his arm. "Then I think you're doing okay," she said. He looked down at her. "Only because of you." And in that quiet, under the wide-open sky, they sat. Not just father and daughter, not just CEO and the girl who saved him, but partners in something larger. A family that had been tested and had chosen to fight forward, not alone, but together. The one-year anniversary of the failed merger arrived quietly, but Richard didn't let it pass unnoticed. It wasn't something to mourn anymore. It had become something to mark, an inflection point in his life and in his daughter's. It was the day everything could have ended, and instead, everything had begun again. The company was thriving. More than just financially, it felt different. There was a tone of sincerity in meetings now, a kind of mutual awareness that hadn't been there before. Department heads no longer filtered information to protect their egos. Young employees spoke more freely, and Richard, once known for being guarded and intimidating, had become someone people trusted not just for his vision, but for his listening. At the heart of it all was the Voice of Conscience program. It had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Other companies had reached out asking to replicate it. It won awards for ethical innovation. Ellie's name was now quietly recognized throughout the company, though not as a figurehead or some symbolic mascot. She was something more than that. She was a story everyone knew, a whisper of truth that had become a force of change. That night, the company hosted its annual leadership gala in a newly built event hall overlooking the river. The space glittered with soft lights and glass walls. The most influential names in tech, business, and journalism were there, some with genuine admiration, others with curiosity. It was formal but warm, elegant without being cold. And at the center of the room stood Richard Hale, not with a contract in hand, but with a microphone. He stood in his signature navy suit, one hand in his pocket, the other loosely holding a note card he never looked at. His expression was calm but not distant. He looked grounded, alive. A year ago, he began, we stood on the edge of a decision that would have changed everything. And if not for a 10-year-old girl in a blue dress, I might have made the worst mistake of my career. The room chuckled lightly, respectfully. She wasn't in the room that day by accident. She wasn't meddling. She wasn't confused. She was aware of something the rest of us had missed. She had no stake in the business, no stock options, no title, but she had something more important, the courage to speak. He paused, letting the silence settle. Her voice changed the future of this company, and more than that, she changed me. I thought I had adopted her to give her a second chance at life, but the truth is, she gave me mine. There was no applause yet, just stillness. I'd like to invite her up here now. There was a small rustle in the crowd as heads turned. Ellie stood from her seat near the front, wearing a soft silver blue dress and a simple necklace Richard's late wife had once worn. She walked slowly but confidently to the stage. Her cheeks were pink, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked so small beside the podium, and yet somehow larger than life. Richard stepped aside, giving her space. She took a deep breath and leaned toward the microphone. I didn't stop the merger because I knew what a contract meant, she said quietly. I stopped it because I knew what my father meant to me. And I knew something was wrong, even if I didn't understand every word. I think sometimes adults forget that kids see things too. They hear tone, they feel fear, and they know when something's not right. Her voice didn't shake. I spoke up because I love my dad, that's all. I didn't think I was brave. I just knew I couldn't stay quiet. There was a pause, a long one. Then slowly applause began to spread through the room. Not polite or obligatory, but honest. Richard stepped forward again, now holding a small velvet-covered box. He opened it, revealing a gold medallion on a deep blue ribbon. For courage, he said, his voice quiet, but full. For truth, and for saving a family. He gently placed the medal around her neck. Ellie looked up at him, eyes shining, not from tears, but from something stronger. Pride, connection, belonging. After the applause died down and the cameras were lowered, the two of them stood at the edge of the stage, side by side, looking out over the people who had once only seen Richard as a CEO. Now they saw him as something else. Ellie leaned close and whispered, "Did I do okay?" "You were perfect," he replied. They left the gala not in a flurry of lights or headlines, but with hands clasped tightly together, slipping quietly into the cool night air. The river sparkled below the city skyline, and as they walked toward the car, Richard turned to her. "You know what I realized tonight?" "What?" she asked. "You didn't just save me from making a mistake. You gave me someone to live for again." Ellie smiled. "I already knew that." He looked at her in mock surprise. Of course you did. And together, father and daughter, they stepped into the dark, not afraid of what lay ahead, but ready for it. Because now, no matter what came, they would face it as they always had since that day in the boardroom. Side by side, telling the truth and holding on to each other. This story isn't just about business, betrayal, or even a brave child. To me, it's about how truth can come from the most unexpected place. A 10-year-old girl with no power, no title, and no experience didn't just save a company, she saved the heart of a man who had almost lost faith in people. It's not a story of exposure. It's a story of restoration, of how real family isn't built by blood, but by choice, by standing beside someone when no one asks you to, and speaking up when everyone else stays silent. Richard, having lost everything, became a father again, not by law, but by love. Ellie, once a quiet shadow in someone else's story, became the light in a room full of blind adults. And that's why the ending is truly happy. Not because the villain was caught, but because love was chosen, again, and without hesitation.